Hey there. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or castles or the kind of history that gets painted in bright colors and hung on stone walls. Tonight is about the kind of people history usually forgets. The ones who didn't write chronicles, didn't own land, and didn't expect comfort to be part of life. Tonight is about surviving the cold. Before we begin, settle in, shift your weight, let the room grow quiet. Maybe there's a soft mechanical hum somewhere nearby, a fan, a distant road, something steady, something ordinary. Good. That's all you need. Now, imagine a night so cold it doesn't rush at you, it waits. Winter didn't arrive loudly in the village of Bramble Hollow. It crept in the way mold does, slow and patient, claiming corners one by one. First, the puddles stiffened into dull gray plates. Then the soil refused the shovel. By the time anyone admitted it was truly winter, the cold had already memorized the shape of every home. The people of Bramble Hollow lived low to the ground, as if they'd learned long ago that standing tall only gave the wind more of you to steal. Their houses crouched along the slope, pressed close together like animals sharing warmth. From a distance, they looked less like buildings and more like something that had grown there accidentally. Inside one of those homes, a man named Edrin lay awake. Not because he was worried. Worry took energy. This was simpler than that. He was awake because his left foot had gone numb again, and numbness was never something to ignore. The room smelled like smoke, old straw, damp wool, and the faint sourness of last night's stew. The fire had shrunk to a dull orange nest of embers, barely alive, breathing in shallow pulses. Every few seconds, a spark shifted, and the light crawled across the packed dirt floor like a slow insect. Edrin didn't move right away. Movement wasted heat. Instead, he flexed his toes inside his sock, testing sensation. Pain followed. Good. Pain meant blood was still arguing with the cold. Beside him, his sister Mara slept with her knees drawn tight to her chest, her breath thin but steady. Beyond her, their mother lay wrapped in two cloaks that used to belong to their father. The cloaks still held his shape, as if warmth remembered him even when people didn't. Near the door, the goat stirred. It was an ugly animal, sharp-eyed and narrow-shouldered, but tonight it was worth more than gold. The heat from its body pooled in the room, subtle but real. Edrin had dragged it inside weeks ago when the nights turned dangerous. No one complained. Pride froze faster than fingers. The wind pressed against the walls, testing them the way fingers test rotten wood. Somewhere, straw rustled in the roof. Something small moved, something alive. Edrin didn't care what it was. If it wasn't biting, it could stay. Winter nights were long, not because the sun disappeared, but because time itself slowed. Minutes stretched, hours felt thick. The dark didn't move forward, it settled. Edrin reached out slowly, careful not to let cold rush into the spaces his body had warmed. His fingers found the poker by memory alone. He leaned just enough to nudge the embers. The fire responded with reluctance, a soft sigh, a glow that briefly pretended it could still win. That was winter in Bramble Hollow, not a battle, a negotiation. People here didn't expect to defeat the cold. They expected to survive it quietly, one night at a time, without drawing attention. Outside, the frost listened. The house itself was no more than a shell, sticks woven together and smeared with mud, straw, and whatever else had been close at hand when it was built. The walls had cracked over the years, hairline fractures that no amount of patching ever truly sealed. Moss stuffed into the gaps helped, but only in the way a thin blanket helps in a blizzard. The floor was earth, real earth, the kind that remembered summer and resented winter. It radiated cold upward, patient and relentless. Edrin could feel it through the straw mat beneath him, through the cloth, through bone. People liked to imagine that night brought rest.
In winter, night brought vigilance. If the fire died, the cold crept faster. If the wind shifted, smoke filled lungs instead of escaping. If someone slept too deeply, they sometimes didn't wake up. No one said that part out loud. Earlier that evening, the village had gathered in the longhouse, a low building at the center of Bramble Hollow. It wasn't warmer there, not really, but bodies made a difference. Heat stacked, breath layered. People leaned shoulder to shoulder, not for comfort, but efficiency. They'd spoken quietly, not stories, not jokes, inventory. Who had straw left? Who had peat? Which roof was leaking again? Which child had started coughing? Winter turned everyone into accountants. An old man named Corvin had mentioned the frost line creeping closer to the well. That mattered. If the crack of the tree echoed longer than it should have. Sound traveled strangely in winter, sliding across the frozen air instead of sinking into it. Edrin counted his breaths until the echo finally dissolved into silence. Silence, he knew, was never empty. It was full of waiting. The embers dimmed again, retreating into themselves like tired animals. Edrin didn't reach for them this time. He let the fire rest. There was a careful balance to tending heat. Feed it too often, and you burned through fuel before dawn. Ignore it too long, and the room surrendered. Winter punished impatience. The cold settled deeper into the house, slow but confident. It crept along the floor first, claiming the spaces between straw fibers, stiffening them until they whispered when anyone shifted. The dirt beneath hardened, turning from earth into something closer to stone. Cold didn't rush upward. It rose the way fog does, invisible until it's already around your ankles. Mara stirred, just a little. A breath caught, then steadied. Good. Edrin stayed awake. Most nights the village followed an unspoken system. Someone in each house remained half-conscious, drifting but never fully gone. A watcher, though no one used that word. It wasn't bravery, it was necessity. Sleep was dangerous when the cold decided to change its mind. Outside, Bramble Hollow lay buried in darkness. The moon was thin, pale, useless. Snow from earlier in the week had crusted over, its surface hard enough to hold weight, but brittle enough to betray you. Every roof wore a white cap. Every path had vanished. The longhouse stood at the center of it all, hunched and quiet. Inside, its fire had been banked low, tended by whoever had drawn the short straw that night. They would sit there alone, listening to the wood pop and settle, marking time by how often they had to stand and stomp, feeling back into their feet. Time in winter wasn't measured by clocks. It was measured by discomfort. In Edrin's house, the smoke thickened briefly as a shift in the wind pressed it back inside. His throat tightened, eyes stung. He turned his head just enough to breathe cleaner air. This too was normal. Smoke was an old companion. It burned and irritated, but it also meant the fire still lived. The roof creaked. Not loudly, just enough to remind the people beneath it that it existed, that it carried weight, that it might one day decide not to. Thatched roofs aged quickly in winter. Moisture froze, expanded, loosened bindings. When the thaw came, things collapsed without warning. But that was a problem for another season. Thinking too far ahead was a luxury. Edrin focused on now. His fingers were stiff. He tucked his hands under his armpits, trapping what heat he could. His breath fogged faintly, even indoors. That meant the air was close to freezing, close enough to be dangerous if the fire failed. He thought of the well again. Water was everything. They kept a bucket inside the house during winter, wrapped in cloth, set near the hearth. Even so, ice formed along the edges most nights. In the morning, they chipped it away carefully, saving every shard. Waste was unforgivable. Some winters, the well froze solid despite everything. When that happened, people melted snow instead, trading heat for water, watching their precious fuel disappear faster than it should have. Last year, an argument had broken out over whose turn it was to haul snow from the higher drifts. Voices had risen. Someone had slipped. A wrist had broken. Cold made tempers brittle. The goat shifted again, hooves scraping softly against the dirt. Its body heat was steady, reliable. Animals didn't complain. They didn't panic. They simply endured, and in doing so, taught humans how little drama survival actually required. Edrin's eyelids dropped. He let them, just a little. Not sleep, just rest. Images floated up uninvited. A summer evening by the stream, Mara laughing, feet in the water, their mother humming something without words, the smell of warm grass. The memory felt almost dangerous, like leaning too far toward a cliff edge. Warmth, remembered too clearly, made the present harder to tolerate. He pulled back. A sound cut through the quiet. Not wind, not wood. A cough. It came from the other side of the wall. Edrin's eyes snapped open. The cough was weak, wet, pulled from deep in the chest. He recognized it immediately. Old Corvin. The sound had followed him all autumn, growing worse as the air grew colder. Coughs were bad in winter. They stole heat. They stole breath. They stole strength. Edrin listened carefully. The cough came again, then stopped. A pause. Too long. He held his breath. Then another cough, thinner than the last. Edrin exhaled slowly. Tomorrow someone would check on Corvin, not tonight. Moving through the cold after dark was a gamble no one took unless they had to. You stayed put. You waited for morning. Winter taught patience with sharp edges.
The cold did not retreat. It only paused, as if listening. Edrin kept his breathing slow and shallow. Every breath mattered now. Too deep, and the air burned his lungs. Too fast, and his body wasted what little warmth it still held. The fire had sunk back into itself, a low orange glow barely strong enough to pretend it could still help. The walls answered the cold with soft clicks as the mud tightened and the straw shifted. Tiny sounds, easy to miss, but Edrin had learned to hear them. Winter spoke quietly. He listened for what mattered. The fire's faint crackle, the goat's steady breathing, Mara's uneven sleep, their mother's slow, tired sighs. Outside, the village lay frozen and still. Snow crested the roofs and paths alike, turning everything into the same dull shape. The longhouse stood silent at the center, its fire banked low, guarded by whoever had drawn the lonely watch that night. Edrin's fingers tingled, the pain fading into numbness. That was dangerous. He tucked his hands deeper under the cloak, pressing them against his ribs. Heat shared was heat saved. A memory surfaced without warning. Another winter, the night the longhouse fire had nearly died. The silence then had been worse than the cold. Silence meant exposure. Silence meant the cold had found a way in. A soft cough cut through the room. Edrin's eyes opened fully. Not outside, inside. Mara. Her shoulders tightened as she coughed again, a thin, sharp sound pulled from deep in her chest. Edrin turned slowly, careful not to send cold rushing into the space he had warmed. Her skin glistened faintly with sweat. Sweat in winter was a quiet threat. He reached out and touched her forehead. Too warm, fever warm, the kind that fought the cold by burning inward instead of pushing it away. Edrin didn't wake her. He loosened the cloak at her neck just enough to let heat escape without inviting the cold in, the kind of adjustment learned only through watching and losing.
The fire dimmed again. He hesitated, then added the last thin stick of kindling. It caught reluctantly, smoke thickening before the flame steadied. The room brightened just enough to remind them it was still there. Outside, something moved near the wall, too light for a person, too careful. A fox, maybe, or a stray dog. Hunger made animals brave. Winter made everyone desperate. Whatever it was passed on. The night dragged itself forward, not marked by hours but by sensations, the fire shrinking, the cold pressing closer, the faintest change in the air as the sky began, slowly to lighten. Edrin's thoughts narrowed, not sleep, just focus. Breathe, listen, wait. Somewhere in the village a rooster tried to crow. The sound cracked and failed, swallowed by the frozen air. Edrin allowed himself a slow exhale. Morning was thinking about coming. Not yet, but soon. Ice creaked across the roofs as the frost loosened its grip by a fraction. The house groaned softly, wood answering cold. It held. Edrin leaned back, tension easing just enough to survive the last stretch of darkness. He did not close his eyes. He did not move. That was how winter was endured. Not by comfort, not by hope, but by staying awake long enough to see the light return.
The light did not arrive all at once. It never did in winter. It seeped in slowly, a thin gray presence that made shapes visible without making them friendly. Edrin noticed it first along the edge of the door, where darkness loosened its grip just enough to show the warped grain of the wood. The cold did not lift with the light. If anything, it sharpened, as if offended by the intrusion. Mara's breathing steadied. Not normal, but steadier. That was enough for now. The fire was nearly spent. Embers glowed dully, fragile as old memories. Edrin didn't add more fuel. Morning was close enough that saving it mattered less than movement. Once the sun existed, even weakly, bodies could do some of the work heat had been doing all night. He shifted carefully, joints protesting with a stiffness that felt permanent until it wasn't. He stamped his feet lightly against the dirt floor, encouraging blood back into places it had abandoned hours ago. Pins and needles flared. He welcomed it. Outside, the village woke the way frost cracked, quietly, unevenly. A door opened somewhere uphill, its hinges complaining. Another followed. Smoke thickened above the roofs as fires were coaxed back to life. The air filled with the smell of damp wood and peat, sharp and familiar. Edrin crossed to the door and rested his palm against it before opening. The wood burned with cold. He breathed once, then lifted the latch. The world outside was colorless. Snow reflected the pale sky, flattening everything into shades of gray. Breath hung in the air, visible proof of effort. A man across the path bent low, breaking ice from a bucket with the careful patience winter demanded. Edrin stepped out, pulling the cloak tight. The cold hit him immediately, harder than it had inside. Open space had no mercy. It wrapped around his legs, climbed his spine, settled behind his eyes. He scanned the slope. Most houses showed signs of life, smoke, movement, a good sign. Near the bottom, one roof sagged more than it should have. He filed that away. Someone would need help before it collapsed. Corvin's house was quiet. Too quiet. Edrin didn't move toward it yet, not alone. You didn't go knocking on doors in winter without reason and witnesses. Silence could mean many things. Not all of them were endings. He returned inside. Mara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. She swallowed, grimaced. "Water," she whispered. Edrin nodded and poured carefully from the bucket near the hearth.
breaking a thin skin of ice before filling the cup. He helped her drink slowly, watching for shivers, for weakness. She finished and sank back, exhausted by the effort. Their mother was awake now, watching without speaking. She met Edrin's eyes and nodded once. No panic, just understanding. The goat bleated softly, impatient. Animals sensed change. Morning meant movement. Movement meant food. Edrin wrapped his hands around the cup, absorbing what warmth remained. Outside, voices carried faintly, low, practical, the language of survival. The night had passed. Not cleanly, not kindly, but it had passed. Edrin pulled on his boots, stiff and uncooperative, and prepared to step back into the cold. Winter did not end with dawn. It simply allowed you to stand up again. And for now, that was enough.
The village did not wake suddenly. It stirred. A soft sound of movement drifted through the cold air, wood against wood, a door opening slowly, as if afraid to make noise. Somewhere nearby, a fire was coaxed back to life, its smoke rising thin and pale into the winter sky. Edrin stepped outside and paused. The morning was colorless, not dark, not bright, just a quiet gray that made everything look unfinished. Snow covered the ground in a hard, uneven crust, reflecting the weak light upward. Each breath hung in the air for a moment before fading away. The cold wrapped around him immediately, stronger than it had been inside. Open space had no patience. He pulled his cloak tighter and looked across Bramble Hollow. Most houses showed signs of life, smoke curling upward, a figure bending low near a doorway, another stamping their feet, slow and deliberate. These were good signs. These meant the night had let go. Near the lower slope, one roof sagged more than it should have. Edrin noticed it without reacting. Problems were stored away for later. Winter demanded order. He turned his attention to Corvin's house. It was still quiet. No smoke, no movement, just the shape of the roof resting under frost, unchanged. Edrin didn't go to it, not yet. Winter taught patience before curiosity. Silence could mean many things. Some of them solved themselves by waiting. He went back inside. The room felt smaller now, as if the night had compressed it. The goat shifted impatiently, sensing morning. Mara lay still, eyes closed, her face pale but calmer than before. Their mother sat upright, wrapped tightly in her cloak, watching the door. "He's quiet," she said softly. Edrin nodded. No names were needed. He poured water carefully, breaking the thin ice at the surface before filling the cup. He helped Mara drink slowly, one careful swallow at a time. She winced, then relaxed, the effort draining her. When she lay back down, her breathing settled again. Outside, voices carried faintly, low, practical, no laughter, just the sounds of people counting what remained. Edrin pulled on his boots. They resisted at first, stiff with cold, then gave in. He stood, feeling the weight of the day press gently onto his shoulders. Winter was not finished, but the night was, and that, for now, was enough. The morning continued without ceremony. The sky remained pale and distant, offering light without warmth. Frost clung to every surface, stubborn and exact, outlining roof beams, fence posts, and footprints left too long in one place. The village moved within it carefully, as if afraid the cold might notice sudden motion. Edrin returned to his house only briefly. He checked on Mara once more. Her eyes opened this time, clearer, though tired. She did not speak. She did not need to. He placed another folded cloth near her neck, a silent promise that he would be back. Outside again, the day asked for attention.
Someone called out near the sagging roof he had noticed earlier. Not a shout, just a name spoken firmly. A small group gathered, tools in hand. No one complained. Wood was braced, straw was packed tighter, snow was scraped away before its weight could decide things for them. The roof held, barely. That was enough. Work in winter was slow. Every task took longer. Fingers numbed, breath shortened, muscles resisted movement until they were convinced it was necessary. No one rushed. Rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes had a way of lasting all season. The well became the next point of focus. Buckets were lowered carefully, ropes stiff as old bone. Ice was chipped away in thin, patient layers. Water rose dark and cold, reflecting the pale sky like a memory of something warmer. Each bucket was hauled with care, carried close to the body to keep it from freezing solid before it reached shelter. Edrin worked alongside the others, his movements steady, practiced. He listened more than he spoke. The sounds around him were enough. Rope against wood, ice cracking softly, breath moving in and out of wool and cloth. Occasionally, someone paused to stomp their feet, to rub their hands together. Pain bloomed, then faded. Heat followed. This rhythm repeated itself all morning. By midday, the light shifted slightly, not brighter, just different. Shadows softened. The cold remained, but it no longer felt quite so sharp. The worst hours of the morning had passed. Edrin carried a bucket back toward his house, shoulders burning from the effort. Steam rose faintly from the water, vanishing almost as soon as it appeared. Inside, the fire had been coaxed back into something respectable. The goat chewed patiently, unimpressed by human concerns. Their mother took the bucket with a nod. She moved carefully, conserving energy the way winter demanded. Mara sat up against the wall now, wrapped in every layer they owned. Her face was still pale, but her eyes followed him. That, more than anything, eased the tightness in his chest. "Later," she murmured. Edrin nodded. Outside again, the village settled into a quieter rhythm. There was less movement now. People retreated indoors, saving strength for the long stretch ahead. Winter days were short. You did what you could before the light decided it was finished. As afternoon slid toward evening, the temperature dipped again, subtly, enough to be felt, enough to remind everyone that night would return soon, unchanged by the day's small victories. Edrin helped bank the longhouse fire, layering peat and ash with practiced care. Someone else took the night watch. There were no words exchanged. The understanding passed silently between them. By the time he returned home, the sky had begun its slow dimming. Gray deepened toward blue. Shadows stretched, then merged. The village grew still again. Inside, the house felt warmer than it had any right to. Bodies helped, the fire helped, familiarity helped. They ate quietly, a thin stew, warm, filling enough to matter. No one lingered over it. Eating was another task, not a pleasure. As darkness settled fully, Edrin took his place near the hearth once more. The goat lay down, satisfied. Mara shifted closer, her breathing steady. Their mother closed her eyes, resting without fully sleeping. Outside, the frost returned to its patient work. The night would be long again. It always was. But the house had held. The village had held. And for tonight, that was enough to let the dark come quietly.
The hearth glowed low, stubborn as ever, refusing to surrender fully to the dark. Edrin shifted slightly, careful not to jostle Nara. Her warmth pressed against him, steady, human, and reassuring in the quiet room.
Outside, the wind whispered across the village, brushing against walls and roofs, but it did not enter here. Not yet. Not while they kept watch. The night deepened, folding over itself. Shadows from the fire stretched long across the walls, leaning toward the corners like tentative fingers. The smoke curled slowly upward, weaving through the rafters before slipping out through the cracks in the roof. Every inhalation brought the familiar sting of it to Edrin's lungs, a harsh companion, but one that meant the fire lived. A soft creak came from above. The roof shifted under frost and weight, but the sound was slow, deliberate, nothing sudden, nothing dangerous yet. Every winter, Edrin learned, the house breathed along with the cold, a quiet warning that patience was required. The goat stirred, tiny hooves pressing against the floor, reminding him that life, stubborn and warm, persisted despite the frost. Its breath fogged faintly, joining the faint haze that lingered over the fire. Mara's eyes fluttered again, half awake but unwilling to move. He did not speak, did not need to. In this long stretch of night, silence was the language of survival. He thought of the frost outside, the way it claimed the smallest cracks first, growing, persistent, and patient. It did not rush, it did not panic. It only waited for the opportunity to press further into the world, inch by invisible inch. That was winter's rhythm, and every inhabitant of Bramble Hollow had learned to move alongside it, carefully, deliberately. A sudden sound drew his attention, a small thump, soft against the frozen floor beyond the wall. Not close enough to be a threat, not human either. Something small, perhaps a rodent seeking warmth in the cracks of the house. Edrin's eyes followed the movement in the dim firelight, but it vanished before it could be identified. Small intrusions were part of life in winter. Ignoring them was the only strategy. The embers pulsed faintly, low heat radiating outward. He stretched his legs carefully, feeling the stiff ache in his knees and hips, the reminder of hours spent half immobile on straw. Pain was familiar, a companion, and its return meant blood flowed again. That small gift of warmth spread slowly through him, welcomed with quiet acknowledgement. A soft cough came from above. The roof shifted under frost and weight, but the sound was slow, deliberate, nothing sudden, nothing dangerous yet. Every winter, Edrin learned, the house breathed along with the cold, a quiet warning that patience was required. The wind shifted outside, rattling a shutter somewhere along the slope. It was loud enough to make the walls vibrate, soft enough to be ignored if one held still. Winter sounds carried far, and the village learned to read them like text. A shutter rattle could mean frost, ice, or simply the slow weight of snow. Every sound was measured, every sound was considered. He glanced once more at the fire. The glow was faint, almost unsteady, yet it persisted. It was more than warmth, it was life. Every small flame held the room together against the night that would not relent. Smoke and soot were tolerable, pain and discomfort acceptable, because the fire's presence was constant, unyielding. Hours stretched slowly. Edrin counted them quietly by the fire's pulsing light, by Mara's steady breath, by the shifting shadows. Every heartbeat, every small inhalation, every faint creak of the house was a marker. Time in winter was not measured in hours, but in endurance, and endurance was the rhythm they had learned to follow since childhood. Outside, the frost crept upward again, reclaiming what it could, inch by invisible inch. Inside, the fire held its ground, stubborn, flickering, persistent. Edrin felt it against his back and in his chest, felt Mara's warmth next to him, and allowed the quiet to settle. The night was long, the cold was constant, but here, in this fragile, smoky circle, life remained unbroken, steady, patient. And so Edrin stayed awake, listening, watching, breathing in time with the night, letting the hours slip past in careful, measured silence.
The night stretched on, endless and patient, yet not cruel. The wind howled faintly beyond the walls, sliding through cracks and rattling loose thatch. Each sound was a reminder, soft and steady, that the cold existed outside, but could not yet claim this small circle of warmth. Edrin shifted slightly, careful not to disturb Mara. Her breathing was even now, slow, steady, a quiet rhythm that contrasted the restless world beyond the walls. The goat lay with its head tucked beneath a worn blanket, oblivious to the frost gnawing at the edges of the room. Life persisted stubbornly here, inside this fragile sanctuary. The embers pulsed faintly, low and steady, reluctant to die. He reached out, brushing his fingers over them. Heat radiated slowly, soaking into his palms, reminding him that small warmth was everything. Outside, the world was hard and merciless. Inside, fire and human bodies and a few layers of straw fought back against it. A soft, deliberate sound came from the roof, wood contracting, frost shifting. The house breathed in response to the night, settling gradually under the weight of snow. Edrin listened. Every creak, every moan, every whispering draft mattered. He did not move hastily. Winter punished haste. The cold seeped in faintly through the floorboards. Edrin pressed his feet against the straw-covered ground, willing blood back into them. Pain bloomed, dull and insistent. It meant he was alive. That meant something. He welcomed it. Movement brought warmth, slowly, painfully, but inevitably. Patience was the way through. Mara shifted, sighing lightly in her sleep. The blanket rustled. Edrin leaned closer and adjusted it, careful not to wake her. Small gestures, almost invisible, were the measure of care in a winter like this. Survival was never dramatic. It was quiet, constant, precise. Outside, the wind shifted again, rattling a shutter, skimming the roofline. Edrin's ears twitched, listening. Nothing approached too quickly. The frost had not claimed the house. The night was patient, but not yet cruel. He returned his attention to the fire, letting the low glow fill the edges of the room, keeping shadows from collapsing entirely into darkness. The goat stirred, faint hooves pressing against the straw, reminding him of life's persistence. He let his hand brush along its back, sharing warmth. Animals did not fear winter like people did. They endured it, silently, steadily. There was something instructive in that. Hours passed slowly, not measured by clocks or sun, but by small signs: the embers' pulse, Mara's even breathing, the house creaking with frost and fatigue. Each sound was counted, catalogued, understood. This was winter's rhythm. To survive, one learned to move in sync with it, slow and careful. Edrin's mind wandered in that quiet, not thinking of past or future, only noting the night, the faint scratch of frost on the doorframe, the shifting shadows across the walls, the faint hiss as snow slid slightly off the roof outside. Every tiny detail mattered. A distant voice rose briefly across the slope, low and muted, calling a name. A neighbor checking another roof. Another small gesture of life persisting through the cold. Edrin allowed himself a faint nod. Connection mattered, even if brief, even if silent. The fire flared once, briefly bright, then receded into steady embers. Smoke curled upward, twisting, softening into the low gray light filtering from the window. It was enough. Heat, light, quiet company. Life persisted,
stubborn and gentle. Idrin leaned back against the wall, letting the small warmth seep into him. He breathed in the smell of peat, of straw, of faint smoke, letting it steady his heart. Mara lay close, breathing in rhythm with him. The goat pressed near the fire. Outside, the wind continued its patient whispers, unhurried, indifferent. Night was long, cold was constant, yet here, in this small circle, life persisted, slow, quiet, enduring. And so, Edrin stayed awake, listening, watching, breathing in time with the night, letting each hour drift past softly, steadily, like smoke curling toward the fragile roof above.
Outside, the wind shifted again, brushing against the longhouse walls with a soft, persistent hiss. Snow scraped across the roof in tiny waves, a sound almost like whispered counting, marking the slow passage of time. Edrin pressed his palms together, letting the warmth build, just enough to keep fingers from stiffening completely. The night was long, but small warmth mattered. Mara stirred lightly, stretching her small shoulders beneath the heavy blanket. Her breath was even, but shallow, and Edrin reached out to adjust the folds, careful to let her warmth remain enclosed without letting the chill slip inside. Survival required these quiet gestures, precise and patient. Every small movement mattered more than grand actions ever could. The goat lifted its head briefly, sniffing the smoky air before settling again near the hearth. Its steady presence was a quiet comfort, a reminder that life endured even in the harshest conditions. Outside, the village was silent. Smoke rose slowly from a distant chimney, curling lazily into the gray sky, carrying the scent of damp wood and peat. Another house stirred with life, measured and careful, as if the world itself recognized that winter demanded patience. Edrin shifted again, stretching his stiff back, listening. The house groaned softly, wood contracting under the cold. Tiny icicles clung to the eaves, fragile and gleaming faintly in the muted morning light. He watched them for a moment, tracing the slow inevitability of their growth. Even frozen, life moved in quiet ways. The embers of the fire glowed softly, low and steadfast. He added a small piece of peat, careful not to let smoke overwhelm the room. It flared briefly, then settled back into its steady glow. The smell of burning peat mingled with straw, faintly sweet and bitter together. Edrin breathed it in slowly, letting the warmth seep through his chest. Even small heat was victory in a night like this. A distant thump reached his ears, not loud, not urgent, something small, likely a fox or a stray cat, testing the edge of the village for warmth or scraps. Edrin listened and waited, not moving. Survival in winter was about stillness as much as action. The night carried patience, and patience carried life. Mara coughed softly, a thin, brief sound that reminded him of how fragile human warmth could be. He leaned closer, smoothing the blanket around her shoulders again, ensuring no gaps let the cold press in. Her eyes fluttered open slightly, then closed. He did not speak. Words were unnecessary. Care was shown in presence, in movement, in the quiet adjustments made to sustain life. Time passed slowly, measured in breaths, in flickers of embers, in creaks of frost-laden wood. Each movement in the room was deliberate, precise. The goat shifted, Mara shifted, Edrin shifted, and together they formed a fragile circle of life within the longhouse. Outside, the wind whistled and tugged, but it could not enter here, not fully, not while they held their positions. Another distant sound, the faint scrape of boots against frost, or perhaps wood shifting under weight. Another quiet act of life persisting, enduring. Edrin allowed himself a faint acknowledgement, a nod without sound,
recognizing the shared rhythm of survival. Everyone measured their steps to winter's pace, slow and deliberate, because rushing led only to injury, to frostbite, to mistakes that could last the season. The embers of the fire pulsed faintly, low heat radiating outward, carrying a sense of steadiness. Edrin pressed his palms against it briefly, soaking in warmth, while the night pressed inward from every direction. Life persisted here, stubborn and careful, refusing to be claimed entirely by frost or shadow. Every breath, every pulse of blood, every faint sound mattered. The night did not reward noise or haste. It rewarded quiet endurance. Edrin leaned back, letting the small circle of warmth settle around him. Mara's breath came steady against his side. The goat rested near the embers, and outside, frost continued its slow, patient work. Winter was long, cold was relentless, but within the firelight, within this fragile human bubble, life held its ground. And so the hours continued, drifting past softly, measured by embers, breath, and frost, until the faintest hint of gray light suggested that morning, in its own slow, careful way, was returning once more.
The gray light grew imperceptibly, spreading across the frozen village in thin, soft layers. It did not bring warmth, not yet, but it let shapes emerge from shadow. Roofs, chimneys, snow-covered paths, the faint outlines of trees bowed under ice. Winter was patient, allowing light to exist without mercy. Edrin stepped carefully to the door. The wood was cold, biting at his fingers, and he let it linger in his palms a moment before lifting the latch. The world outside remained still, gray and measured. Snow crunched softly under his boots as he stepped onto the frozen path. Every sound echoed in the quiet, sharp against the hush of frost. A distant smoke trail marked life elsewhere. Another house, another hearth holding steady. The villagers moved slowly, deliberately. Each carried fire or water, tools or buckets. Motion was careful. Haste was punished silently by frost and misstep. Edrin measured every step, letting the cold press, reminding him that he belonged to it temporarily, as long as he remembered respect. He glanced toward the sagging roof across the slope. Someone had begun work there already, hammering lightly, packing straw tighter, moving with patience rather than force. The structure shifted with snow weight, protesting gently, but held. That was enough for now. Winter demanded slow victories. Returning to the longhouse, Edrin noticed Mara's eyes open, pale but alert. She shivered lightly beneath layers of cloth. He adjusted her blanket without a word, pressing warmth close. Care in winter was quiet, deliberate, often unseen, but every movement mattered more than loud gestures. The goat stirred, nudging closer to the embers. Heat radiated slowly, faint but constant. Edrin pressed his palms to it again, soaking in what little energy it offered. The embers glowed low, a small, stubborn light in the dim gray world. It was enough. Small victories were the only kind that mattered. A faint scratching sound came from above, along the roof. Tiny shifts in frost, snow settling, wood contracting. Edrin listened, waiting. Nothing urgent, nothing sudden. Survival demanded attention without panic. Frost was patient. Winter was precise. He looked around the room. Every shadow stretched longer, pushed by the weak morning light. Smoke rose from the fire, curling in slow, deliberate spirals before slipping out through the cracks. The scent of peat and straw mingled with cold air, a reminder that warmth and life persisted, however fragile. Time passed in small increments, breaths,
shifts in the goat, Mara's shallow exhale. Every detail counted. Outside, snow shifted lightly with the wind. Distant voices carried faintly, low and measured. Neighbors moving deliberately through the village, performing quiet acts of survival. Edrin's joints ached with stiffness, a dull, constant reminder of the night's vigil. He stretched slowly, allowing the discomfort to draw blood and warmth back into frozen muscles. Pain was acceptable here. Pain meant life persisted. He welcomed it quietly, deliberately, a small acknowledgement that he remained. The world held still outside. Inside, the longhouse thrummed with quiet life. Mara shifted closer. The goat pressed near the fire, and Edrin leaned back against the wall, letting warmth seep into his chest. The house creaked softly with frost, a measured rhythm, an endurance of endurance. Hours passed slowly. The gray light strengthened, shifting shadows, but warmth remained human, careful, contained. Life persisted stubbornly, measured in breaths, in embers, in subtle movements. Winter's pressure was relentless, but it could not entirely claim this fragile circle of existence. And so, Edrin remained awake, listening, breathing, measuring the slow rhythm of survival, letting each moment drift past softly as gray light and faint warmth pressed carefully against the edges of the long, patient night.
The gray light continued to creep through the small window, thin and measured, casting soft shadows across the straw-strewn floor. Edrin moved carefully, each step deliberate, mindful of the frozen boards beneath his feet. Every motion was calculated. Haste could crack a joint, slip a boot, or let the cold press closer than it had a right to. Winter demanded patience, and he had learned to obey it fully. Mara stirred faintly, shifting beneath the layers of blankets. Her small shoulders trembled just enough to remind him of how fragile warmth could be. Edrin leaned closer, adjusting the folds around her neck and shoulders without disturbing her sleep entirely. Each gesture was precise, deliberate, measured, tiny acts of care that became monumental in the slow, quiet hours of a winter morning. The goat stirred again, pressing its head toward the embers, letting heat seep slowly into its body. Its warmth radiated outward just enough to brush against Edrin's leg. He leaned slightly, letting it press back, sharing life in the simplest, quietest way. Outside, the wind whistled softly through the gaps in the roof, rattling small pieces of thatch. But inside, heat persisted in careful, stubborn pulses. A faint thump echoed from the floor above, soft and slow. Frost shifting, wood contracting under the weight of ice and snow. Edrin's ears caught it without surprise. Each sound was part of winter's rhythm, a language he had learned over years of long nights. He did not move hastily, he simply listened, marking each note, letting the cold dictate its own pace. The fire pulsed gently, low and steady, smoke curling into the thin cracks above. Edrin added a small fragment of peat, careful not to flare smoke into the room. The glow spread slowly, enough to push shadows back from corners, enough to warm stiff fingers and aching joints. Heat, however small, became a lifeline, an anchor in the gray monotony of frost and shadow. Outside, a faint scrape of boots against frost carried across the slope. Another villager, deliberate and patient, moving to check a roof or gather firewood. Edrin allowed a faint nod of acknowledgement. Winter demanded attention to these movements, silent coordination, measured steps. Every breath, every shift, every small action could mean survival or the loss of it.
Mara's breathing deepened, steady, predictable. He brushed a hand lightly over her arm, careful not to disturb the fragile rhythm of warmth she carried. Life persisted here, stubbornly, in the quiet of human presence. The goat pressed closer to the fire again, nudging against Edrin's side. Embers glowed faintly, smoke curling in lazy spirals. All of it, tiny movements, faint heat, slow rhythm, formed the invisible scaffolding of survival. Time stretched and folded over itself. Hours were measured not by sun or clock, but by subtle shifts, embers fading, shadows stretching, frost slowly claiming edges of the walls. Outside, snow creaked softly under the faint pressure of wind. Icicles tugged at roof lines. Distant voices carried faintly across the village, low and deliberate, neighbors performing quiet acts of life and survival. Edrin's joints ached again. He stretched slowly, letting the stiffness pull warmth back into frozen muscles. Pain, he reminded himself, was a companion. It meant blood flowed. It meant life persisted. The subtle ache was reassurance, a measure of endurance. He leaned against the wall again, letting the fire's faint warmth seep into him. Mara's breathing remained soft and even. The goat rested by the embers, and outside, frost pressed patient and unrelenting. The house creaked softly under winter's weight, wood contracting with frost and age. Hours passed without words, without sudden motion. Breath, warmth, creaking wood, distant footsteps. The rhythm was constant, unbroken. Outside, winter ruled patiently, pressing against every surface, every gap, every edge. Inside, life held, slow, measured, stubborn. And Edrin remained awake, listening, shifting gently, breathing in time with Mara, the goat, and the fire, letting the long, relentless night drift past softly, insistently, in measured increments of heat, shadow, and quiet endurance.
The fire settled into a softer glow, not weaker, just quieter. The embers breathed in slow pulses, as if conserving themselves for the long hours still ahead. Edrin watched the rhythm for a moment, letting it anchor him. Winter rewarded attention. Neglect, even for a short while, had consequences. The gray outside deepened slightly, not darker, but heavier. Snow drifted in thin lines across the ground, pushed by a wind that had learned the village's shape and followed it faithfully. It slipped between homes, brushed against doors, tested shutters. Inside the longhouse, the air remained still enough to feel earned. Mara shifted again, a small movement, barely more than a breath changing direction. Her hand emerged from the blanket, fingers pale and stiff. Edrin noticed immediately. He covered it gently, folding warmth back where it belonged. Her breathing steadied, the small tremor passing without waking her fully. Care completed itself in silence. The goat exhaled slowly, a warm animal sound that filled the space more than any words could have. Its body radiated heat steadily now, pressed close to the hearth. Edrin adjusted his position slightly, letting the warmth touch his knee, then his thigh. Shared warmth was not comfort, it was strategy. A faint crack sounded from the roof, not breaking, settling, snow shifting its weight, choosing a new place to rest. Edrin tilted his head, listening, counting the seconds that followed. No further sound. He let his shoulders relax again. Winter often spoke first in whispers. Smoke drifted low before rising, tracing the slow movement of air inside the room. The scent of peat lingered, earthy and dull, a smell that meant safety as much as it meant discomfort. Edrin inhaled shallowly,
used to it, letting it sit in his lungs without complaint. Breathing deeply in winter was a luxury. Outside, a figure crossed the path below, bundled and slow, carrying something heavy. Wood, maybe, or water drawn too early. The person paused briefly, shifting weight, then continued. Edrin followed the movement with his eyes until it disappeared behind another roof. No signal was exchanged. None was needed. Time did not pass. It accumulated. The light pressed a little further into the room now, touching the edge of the wall, the worn grain of wood visible beneath soot and age. Shadows shortened by fractions, barely noticeable unless you were watching for them. Edrin was watching. His hands had warmed enough to move without pain now. He flexed his fingers slowly, once, then again, careful not to waste the heat he had earned. The cold waited for any excuse to return. Mara's breathing changed, deeper now, slower. Sleep had claimed her properly. Edrin stayed still beside her, holding the shape of warmth where it had settled. The goat remained motionless, eyes half closed, body heavy with shared heat. The house creaked again, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. Frost pressed, wood answered, everything held. Edrin leaned his head back against the wall, not closing his eyes, just resting them. The world narrowed to breath, to embers, to the quiet agreement between living things to remain exactly where they were. Outside, winter continued its work. Inside, life continued its refusal. And so the moment remained, unbroken, unhurried, held together by warmth that had to be earned and silence that had to be respected.
The embers shifted again, a subtle collapse inward, sending a brief ribbon of warmth outward before settling. Edrin noticed it immediately. He always did. Fire never moved without meaning in winter. He reached forward and adjusted a charred fragment with the edge of a stick, not feeding it, just encouraging it to stay awake a little longer. The room responded quietly. Heat redistributed itself, thin but intentional. Shadows softened at the corners, retreating just enough to remind him they were temporary guests. Outside, the wind eased, not stopped, winter never stopped, but it loosened its grip, allowing a brief stillness to take hold. Snowflakes drifted straight down now, slow and unhurried, landing without sound. The village seemed to exhale. Edrin remained where he was, balanced between movement and stillness. His body understood this posture well. Too much motion wasted warmth, too little invited stiffness. He found the narrow space between and stayed there. Mara murmured faintly in her sleep, not a word, just sound. It passed as quickly as it came, leaving her breathing unchanged. Edrin did not move, only listened, counting breaths until he was sure she was settled again. Winter paid attention, so did he. The goat shifted its weight, hooves scraping softly against packed dirt. Straw crunched under the movement, releasing a faint, dry scent. The animal settled again, closer to the embers this time, its side rising and falling in a slow, dependable rhythm. Warmth layered itself quietly between bodies. Light continued its careful advance, touching the edge of the door now, revealing old scratches, marks made over years by hands, tools, seasons. Nothing here was decorative. Everything had a reason to exist. A distant sound carried across the snow, wood splitting. Someone had started early, breaking frozen logs with measured effort. The crack echoed once, then faded. Edrin imagined the movement, gloves stiff with frost, breath clouding the air, pauses taken often to let strength return. He nodded once, unconsciously, acknowledging the shared labor of endurance. His shoulders ached. He adjusted slightly,
letting the ache stretch and settle rather than resisting it. Pain softened as warmth followed. The body remembered what it needed if given time. Smoke thinned as the fire steadied, rising in narrow lines that slipped through the roof's imperfect seams. The air cleared just enough to breathe easier. Edrin drew in a slow breath, then another, measured and shallow, keeping heat where it belonged. The house held. No sudden sounds, no urgency, only the slow agreement between wood, fire, flesh, and frost. Minutes, or perhaps longer, passed without distinction. Time had little meaning here. Survival was not counted in hours, but in continuity, in moments that did not break. Edrin rested his palm flat against the ground beside him. The earth was still cold, but less cruel than before. Straw dulled its edge. Warmth had reached further now, quietly winning ground. Mara slept on. The goat breathed. The fire endured. Outside, winter waited, patient as ever. Inside, nothing surrendered. And the moment continued, steady, uninterrupted, carried forward by small choices made carefully, and by warmth held just long enough to become tomorrow. The light outside did not brighten so much as spread, thinning the darkness until it no longer pressed as hard against the walls. Edrin noticed the change in the way shadows loosened their grip, retreating from corners that had held them all night. The room felt wider now, though nothing had moved. The fire answered the shift with a faint settling sound. Ash slid inward, revealing a deeper glow beneath. Edrin leaned forward just enough to adjust the edge of a log, not adding fuel, only changing its angle. The warmth responded, subtle and cooperative. Mara's breathing slowed further, deepening into a rhythm that belonged fully to sleep. Her chest rose and fell with quiet certainty. Edrin remained still beside her, guarding that rhythm without touching it, as if warmth itself might shatter if handled too roughly. The goat exhaled, long and steady. Its warmth was constant now, no longer borrowed but shared. Edrin felt it along his side, grounding him, reminding him that survival was rarely solitary. Bodies leaned together, heat accumulated where it could. Outside, snow slid from a roof somewhere upslope, landing with a muted thump. The sound carried briefly, then vanished into stillness. Edrin waited for more. None came. He relaxed again, the tension easing from his shoulders inch by inch. Smoke traced slow patterns overhead, thinner now, disciplined. It found its way out through old gaps without complaint. The air cleared just enough for the scent of damp wood and straw to surface again, familiar, reassuring. Edrin flexed his toes inside his boots, testing them, stiff but responsive. He pressed them lightly into the packed earth, letting warmth build through motion. The ground no longer felt hostile. Cold remained, but it had withdrawn slightly, conceding space. Time continued without marking itself. Outside, footsteps passed along the lower path, measured, unhurried. Someone paused, then continued on. No voices followed. Winter mornings were not meant for conversation. Energy was saved for what mattered. Light reached the far wall now, revealing the uneven surface, the places where mud and straw had been patched again and again. Each repair told the same story: hold, endure, survive. Nothing here was finished. Everything was maintained. Mara shifted once more, settling deeper into the blankets. Edrin adjusted the edge near her shoulder with 2 fingers, precise and brief. Her breathing did not change. The warmth remained contained. The goat remained still, eyes half closed, body heavy. The fire pulsed softly. The house creaked once, then fell silent again. Edrin leaned back, letting the wall support him fully. His eyes stayed open, tracking nothing in particular. He listened instead, to breath, to embers, to the quiet understanding between all the living things in the room. Outside, winter held its position. Inside, life did the same. And the moment continued, unrushed, unbroken, carried forward by attention, by restraint, and by warmth that was never wasted.
The quiet held longer than Edrin expected. Not empty, not tense, simply held, as if the morning itself understood that it was not yet time to intrude. The light lingered where it was, thin and pale, touching surfaces without warming them, allowing the room to remain half in night. Edrin shifted his weight slightly, careful to keep his movements economical. His knee had begun to ache where it pressed against the ground, a slow, dull reminder that stillness had limits. He drew his leg in a fraction, then extended it again, letting blood move without inviting the cold too close. The ache softened. He stayed there. The fire breathed again, a low crackle that barely disturbed the air. Ash settled, revealing a faint orange line beneath. Edrin watched it for a long moment, gauging whether it needed intervention. It did not. Fires, like people, lasted longer when they were not overworked. Mara's face had relaxed completely now. The tension that winter carved into waking hours had smoothed away, leaving only the softness of sleep. A faint flush had returned to her cheeks, subtle but unmistakable. Edrin noticed it and allowed himself a single quiet breath of relief. He did not linger on it. Relief, like warmth, could not be wasted. The goat stirred again, lifting its head briefly. Its ears twitched, responding to a sound too distant for Edrin to place at first. Then he heard it too, a low creak, followed by a muffled scrape, someone pulling a sled, wood perhaps, or water barrels dragged slowly across packed snow. The sound faded as it moved downhill, swallowed by distance and frost. Edrin rested his hand against the wall beside him. The surface was cool, uneven beneath his palm, textured by years of patching and repair. He traced a familiar ridge with his thumb, a place where mud had cracked once and been pressed back into place before the cold could widen it. The wall had held. It always had, just barely. Light crept another inch across the floor, catching on bits of straw and dirt, turning them briefly silver before moving on. Shadows rearranged themselves without urgency, slipping away from one corner and gathering in another. Nothing resisted. Everything adapted. The air inside felt different now, not warmer exactly, but calmer, less sharp. The cold no longer bit so fiercely when he breathed. Edrin drew in a slow breath, then another, letting his chest rise and fall with the rhythm he had learned over many winters. Fast breathing wasted heat. Slow breathing kept it close. His shoulders relaxed further. The stiffness had eased enough that he could roll them gently, one at a time, releasing tension without pulling warmth away from his core. The movement sent a faint shiver through him, then settled. He stayed still again, letting the body remember equilibrium. Mara shifted her legs slightly, the blankets rustling softly. Edrin waited, hands poised, but she settled without help. He let his hands fall back to his sides. The room returned to its quiet agreement. Outside, the wind returned in small, testing gusts. It brushed against the house, pressed at the roofline, slipped along the walls. The longhouse responded with a low creak, then held firm. Edrin listened carefully. The sound was familiar, no urgency, no weakness revealed. The goat exhaled, warm breath fogging briefly in the cooler air near the floor. It shifted its hooves again, then stilled. Its body heat continued to radiate outward, steady and reliable. Edrin leaned into it just enough to share the warmth without disturbing its rest. Time accumulated quietly.
The light outside strengthened by degrees so small they could only be felt, not seen. The sky beyond the window remained gray, but the gray had depth now, texture, the promise of movement later when the world decided it was ready. Edrin remained where he was, eyes open, breathing slow, body aligned with the room. There would be work soon, wood to split, water to draw, repairs to check, but not yet. For now the only task was to maintain what they had earned through the night. The fire held, the house held, Mara slept, the goat breathed, and within that balance, that narrow, careful balance between cold and warmth, between stillness and motion, the morning continued to arrive, quietly, without demanding anything in return.